a movement like a clean or a snatch or a jerk or a bench or a squat, that's like primary volume.
Yeah, yeah.
Then you have the bodybuilding stuff. So I would lump chin-ups in there for a thrower. Back work that we do, a lot of rows, a lot of pull-ups. That would be secondary volume. The priority is like always managing this. If a problem arises or a projection doesn't occur, you can look at the secondary volume. And that's where it's like, all right, well, the way I set up training is I do undulate with my programming, and it might be 3 weeks of this versus 3 weeks of this, or 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, 1 week. And then I can see when we do something in the weight room that we undulate with either intensity or volume. In the simplest sense, I think about a volume, a rep over 60%, I count. Mm-hmm. At the elite level, even if we're doing, a partial rep, it doesn't matter to me. I'm still just counting it in its simplest sense. And it enables me to see when they're throwing better or worse based off their training, not off of what they think. And I also think like how you just described that, like rep set. And that's the thing with the range throws. It's similar to to me, the range throws would be like a power lifter doing 5 sets of 5, simple thing at 75, 80%. Yeah. You're just creating the stable movement pattern over and over and over and over again. And that's a huge part of a technical movement. And it's similar. It's something in the endurance world that you would call that would be maybe threshold work. So how fast can you run for an hour and a half without having any fatigue, without having any degradation in your pace? That's the same concept as that 5x5, 80% analogy as the range throws. And I think when that's how I like to compare everything in programming, because then it makes me, then if I do read a book on running, I can compare it to throwing, and I can compare it to football or wrestling, and it helps me with those levers.
Now, to throw some nuance into your volume and how you track that, what are you going to do with a movement like chin-ups or Nordic hamstring curls or split squats for some?
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not 60%.
Yeah.
It's body weight, but for some,
it's hard.
That was one of the questions I posed to Mel Siff a long time ago. It's when you're tracking this total volume, how do you track like a glute ham raise to somebody that?
What would he say?
To look at what their max set is, so if it's a set of 10, then base the percentages off that. So if you want it 70%-ish, they're just going to do multiple sets of 7.
Okay.
Or something like that. But a chin up becomes a little more
harder.
Different because it might be 3s.
Yep.
Then you got to find a way to regress it.
Yeah.
The more interesting one that I asked dealt with box jumps, right? Because I can get that. Like you jump to a max box, right? If it's a power lifter, there's your 100%.
Yep.
Then you can break it down based upon the percents of what that's going to be.
Yeah.
And his reply to that was, that's all great, but how are they getting down? You know what I'm saying? Because if they're jumping down, now they're doing a depth jump, right? Yep. So it kind of plays into that.
Yeah.
So it's a question I like to ask other people, because now when you're dealing with some of the athletes that you're dealing with, they can probably, chin-ups are not a big deal.
Yeah, they can rip them.
But push-ups are not a big deal.
Yeah.
Other ones, maybe some of the throwers, that are heavier, that might become more of a big deal.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering how you kind of balance that in.
I think about it as, and this goes back to that Poliquin question. The first question is, I think about it like you've got a movement like a clean or a snatch or a jerk or a bench or a squat. And I know they're slightly different, but you have those movements. In my mind, those are that's like primary volume.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you have the bodybuilding stuff. So I would lump chin-ups in there for a thrower. Back work that we do, a lot of rows, a lot of pull-ups, neutral grip. We do a lot of neutral grip pull-ups. That would be secondary volume. The priority is like always managing this. And if we have this laid out, and I would put Nordics in there even, if a problem arises or a projection doesn't occur, you can look at the secondary volume. And that's where it's like, all right, well, dude's doing, 4 sets of 5 Nordics. He's slaughtered. Of course, he's 315 pounds. Of course, and he's got short legs. So of course, his hamstrings are going to be destroyed. He can't snatch now because he can't finish. So I don't necessarily care about it until a problem comes up, which is probably not the best, and maybe I should change.
No, I get what you're saying, because you're gonna cycle your circle work.
Yeah.
In its own way. Then the primary movements are going to cycle in their own way. Then the secondary movements are going to cycle in whatever way is necessary to keep those other two moving in the way they need to move.
Yes, but when you just described it, and I was thinking through this as a contradiction to myself, and this is where I see a weak point right now, and I'm going to go home and try and think through this a little deeper instead of figuring this out right now on the podcast. Yeah. I try to peak. Let's say August 1st is nationals this year for track. And if we're trying to peak there, and I'm basing my decisions, because a lot of times when we are peaking, we remove accessories. But if I'm not removing accessories in my other points of the year, and I'm seeing a trend in performance in the circle, or as for my weightlifters in the weight room, or it's so different for me with field sports. So wrestling and football, I don't really consider. I think it's a different beast. If I'm testing them and I'm basing their peak program on a year-to-year basis around these 3 periods of where we're looking at their development, but I don't remove accessories that much, and then I do that when we go to peak, I have a little concern currently in my head that could have a negative impact on their performance, because sometimes athletes like a little more tension when they go into a peak. And if my conclusions are based off of something else, a different situation. Do you follow what I'm saying?
No, I kind of get what you're saying, because it's those accessories or supplemental blocks that we're talking about are typically going to be prescribed based upon whatever the weak points are, because when you're dealing with exercises in those blocks, you can't necessarily find correspondence to what you're trying to get the carryover for.
Yeah.
The throws and so forth.
Yeah.
So those are really kind of in there to be able to build the lifts that have that correspondence.
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So if they're in there for that, then you pull them out, you're going to see the super compensation just because you pulled them out. They're going to be able to have that because of that. Where I think this happens with powerlifters a lot, to where sometimes they may have to pull those out just due to time restraints or an injury or whatever it is. And then they realize after a few weeks, holy shit, I'm way stronger. But then what they don't understand is they indirectly just peak themselves without knowing that.
Yeah.
Because you're removing some of the workload, while not substantial, but you're still removing some of that workload, which would decrease a little bit of their on your fear side. What can that decrease a little bit of their work capacity, which may be needed?
Yeah.
Which would have more impact on like the field sports and stuff like that than it would say on throws.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. So when looked at that way, I don't know if intermediately pulling them out would really make that much difference.
Long term, yeah.
Long term, pulling them out as you're moving into other blocks. You have to pull them out because those other blocks are going to be increasing in volume.
Yeah.
Right. So there's only so much volume somebody can recover from. I like to use the analogy of like a video game. You got the little power meter.
Yeah.
Right. But you also have lives and you also have levels. Right. So the goal, is to not let that power meter. So if it's a training day and you're starting at 100%, which normally you're never going to do, but if you're starting at 100% and it starts to tick down, say after the first block of movements, those heavier blocks, if you go from that 80%, now you're with 40%, you only got 40% left for all the rest.
Yeah.
But if that first block of training is grinding, right, for whatever reason, bad day, poor recovery, heavier loads they're just not really accustomed to, and now they only got 20% left, but you don't adjust in that bottom, then you're going to have that systemic fatigue.
And it's going to carry over quicker, yeah.
Which is going to build up, that's when that ability of the coach to be able to regulate the training just on what you see.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've had this.
Yeah.
There's certain things that have to be done. Then after they're done, you're like, dude,
you're done.
Get the fuck out of here.
Yeah.
Then other ones, they smoked it. It's like, okay, cool. You may not necessarily add more stuff, but you may coach them harder to push harder on those other things to be able to push them up, because they're the most expendable.
Well, and that's even where I think there's a point in the year where you I guess the most expendable, yeah, but also like there's a point in the year where I'm like, we need to push harder and harder and harder now.
Yeah, right now.
Yeah.
Where they are now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Probably until February.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's an indoor national championship for track, for shot put, not for discus.
Well, see, that's the tricky part, because then they have to understand their performance may be somewhat compromised, but in the long term,
it's better.
And this is how periodization is supposed to work.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're pretty good with that, because even the magnitude of the world of track and field, people care about indoor nationals. They care about it, but the magnitude is nowhere near the outdoor world championship. So like they are pretty good at seeing like, this is sort of like the experiment for the year. We're going to see how you perform here with this like semi-tapered scenario, and then that's going to set us up for outdoors. So they do a pretty good job with that.
I want to jump down to one of the...
Can I take a pee?
Yeah. Let's take a restroom break. I've spent most of my life training in unconditioned gyms. Do you think cognitive and buzz?
Discussion. And it's like,
the deloads has always been a weird